Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Tyler Cartwright's journey to health began when he found himself weighing in at 505 pounds. His anxiety and depression had caused him to turn to food as a coping mechanism, and he had eaten his feelings for far too long. Over the course of more than a decade of battling to achieve success, he managed to rid his body of 300 pounds of excess weight, completed his undergraduate and graduate studies, and learned to succeed in spite of his anxiety. His story has inspired tens of thousands of people and continues to encourage more with each passing day. Tyler is a highly sought after speaker, having presented to domestic and international audiences about topics ranging from diet and lifestyle, technology and wellness, and sustained change. His business ventures include the founding of the Ketogains Brands, Elemental Labs, At Go Health, and several other businesses that are passion projects of his. Tyler's first book, Kintsukuroi, Rebuilding Hope and Embracing Change, is an unflinching look at his experiences through life, which helped to forge the foundations upon which he built his coaching practice. Tyler Cartwright, what an honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
I'm glad I'm here. Apparently I'm really cool according to all that you just read. I don't know, but
That's pretty cool. We always tell our guests, if any point during the interview you want me to reread that a second or a third time, you just let me know.
Just make me feel good after you beat me down with questions. Let's see how it is now.
That's
all
right.
Good. I appreciate the intro, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Such an honor. You've been somebody who we've had on our radar for quite a long time. I reached out recently to Amy Berger to see if she wanted to come back on and talk about gluconeogenesis. She wrote an article that exploded my brain several years ago talking about gluconeogenesis. That was wonderful. And she said, you really need to get Tyler on to talk about this. So you came highly recommended. So many things that you've been involved with the low carbohydrate space that I'm really curious to talk to you about. But I do want to talk to you first a little bit about your journey. How was your journey into, unhealth, and how were you able to kind of turn that around?
So when I was young, I figured out a couple of things. One, I really liked to read, and two, I was pretty darn strong. Really gave myself into both of those passions pretty violently. And by the time that I was 17 going into 18, I was a 3-lift guy at just under 1,800 pounds. I was kind of fast tracking my way to being a big old strong doofus out there doing a whole bunch of powerlifting stuff. And then I found my way out of high school and into college. And in the process, I was committed. I wasn't really sure if I wanted to go pre-vet or pre-med in that pathway. So like indecisive tool that I am at times, I decided to go down the pathway of biochemistry and cell biology, and just kind of look at splitting the middle, if you will, so that I could take some agricultural classes in case I decided to go work with animals, and if I decided that I was insane enough to go work with people, that I had all of the science creds that I needed to get in there. And so lifting kind of took a back seat at that point. I figured out that you could do a lot of keg stands if you were really strong, and turned my pathway to alcohol with about the same ferocity with which I used to lift weights. I think when you're young, you don't necessarily realize how much exercise becomes sort of an anxiety coping mechanism. And part of why I read and exercised like I did was just because sort of abated a lot of anxieties that I carried around that I didn't even realize were being triggered, if you will, by that. So alcohol does much the same thing. I've joked before that it is the Homer Simpson line, beer, the temporary solution to all of life's problems. I found a love for alcohol and proceeded to reach a point where I could not hold enough alcohol in my stomach to actually get drunk. And I was pretty scared by that, to be really honest with you. And, the one thing I figured out is that pizza never let me down. And it was way cheaper than buying, handles of bourbon and, 2 liters of vodka and that fun stuff. So it is a definite, or was, I guess, a definite realization in retrospect that a lot of these were just coping mechanisms that I was using in healthy things in unhealthy ways, and then unhealthy things in unhealthy ways. And it was a tough go. I'm moved to, to take a job in corporate America, working telecommunications management. And, because that's what you always do when you almost graduate with two science degrees. You finish out in B school and you get an MBA. But jumped into that space. I've always kind of had a technical bent in my brain. I've always thought of the body more like an engine or like a machine than I have like blood and pulp and pus and whatever else. There's another P that fits in there too, but I'll leave that off for your audience. But that's just the way that I've always sort of mechanistically looked at the world. And so it does make some sense, but it's really difficult to go into sales meetings when you're 300, 400, 500 pounds. And, I can recount stories of breaking chairs at conference meetings and, being lambasted in the parking lot and called all sorts of names by sales reps who were just furious at, the embarrassment of having the engineer that they brought in, breaking chairs. And I mean, in retrospect, I can't say I blame them because this is their livelihood and this is their financial, wherewithal on the table. But truthfully, it's one of those things where it's the expression, like when the student's ready, the master appears. It was just a situation where until I was ready to change, I just wasn't ready to change. There was nothing prompting me towards that until went up to actually visit my mother over a weekend. And I guess about a week and a half later, I get a letter in the mail basically telling me that parents aren't supposed to bury their children, and that she was very concerned that that's exactly what she was going to have to do. And I'm a big burly doofus, but I'm still a mama's boy at heart. I think most of us that grow up in the South just sort of get that as a gene. When you're born, it just is like it's a recessive gene that kicks in or something. And so that's mama kicked me in the butt to some degree, and it forced me to really step back and look at things. And I realized that I had become a failure in just about everything that I was doing. I was working, but I was falling asleep at my desk. I would get to the office and have no idea how I even got there. Couldn't remember the drive to or the drive from. My wife and I wanted kids, but that wasn't feasible or possible at that sort of a weight. There were just so many things that I wanted to change. And being a science nerd, I kind of just thought, I wonder if it's possible to come back from kind of peering over the edge and walk your way back towards health. And, the short answer, 16, almost 17 years later is, yeah, it is definitely possible.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
You are so open and honest and vulnerable in your book and in the content you share. It's kind of hard to hear, frankly. I mean, it's a very difficult journey, and it's very raw and riveting. And one of my favorite phrases is, when pain increases, hearing improves. And it just basically, like, you have to get to a point where things suck bad enough for you to want to change, because change is very difficult. It's not that easy to change what you're doing. So you must have gotten to that spot with that letter to at least start to direct you down that road. When did you come in contact with like low carbohydrate diets in that kind of space?
So I had been kind of eating that way off and on for a while. It was, initially my brother had gone on like the old Atkins diet, and there was a part of me that just wanted to prove him wrong because science, right? And, oh, you're going to blow up your kidneys or you're going to kill yourself or whatever. And the more I dug into, physiology textbooks, the more I dug into cell biology textbooks, the more I dug into biochemistry, I was just like, there's nothing wrong with eating this way. Like, I can't find anything that really creates a problem for me where I can be like, hey, bro, you need to read this, or let me send you over some highlights from the study that I found. There just wasn't any of that out there. And so I just was like, well, I'm kind of fat and unhealthy. I might as well try it. And, it worked as long as I kind of stayed with it. But, the biggest challenge is, the pizza restaurant that you've been eating at for 15 years every Friday just kind of calls your name, or drinks with friends or whatever, one drink turns into 15 or whatever. And you're kind of two steps forward, two steps back. So you're always kind of in the same place that you've always been. And, so it really was kind of a natural thing. I really didn't want it to work. I was trying like the zone diet stuff for a while, and really, it's geeky, and zone diet, that stuff's got some real interesting science behind some of the data and some of the research that's been done. And so I was like, ooh, that sounds interesting. And truthfully, I was just like, hey, wait, or I could be eating ribeye. And I just kind of was like, well, any diet that encourages me to have pork rinds and ribeye probably isn't the worst thing in the world. And so, at least for my taste and preferences. And so kind of came into it with a little bit of an intent to disprove, which may be a little different than a lot of folks came into the diet. And then secondarily, kind of my gluttonous streak sort of said, hey, when I was training like I was 17, 18, I was probably eating 12 to 15,000 calories a day in any given day and maintaining a pretty healthy physique, but when you're training 4, 5, 6 hours a day, 5, 6 days a week, you can pretty much get away with a whole lot of dietary indiscretion, especially when you're, in your young prime. In your 30s, you can't get away with that nearly as much. And so it was really first kind of like, ooh, steak. And then afterwards, I was like, I don't feel the need to eat 15,000 calories a day. I can eat 7,000 or 8,000 calories. And cutting your calorie intake in half when you weigh 500 pounds, it's like magic, right? Like who'd have thunk it? You cut it in half and the weight starts to fall off. But yeah, it's been a while. I've been a pretty old school. I don't quite go back as far as Lyle McDonald's ketogenic diet book in '96, but I was sitting here doing the math, and I was like, around 2003, 2004, I guess, is when I really just started playing around with it.
Wow, OG for sure. I love it. That's great. Was Ketogains your first kind of entry point into using this as part of your career? Like getting in the low carbohydrate space is something you wanted to really pursue, as something you wanted to do professionally?
So, it's funny. I spent a lot of time working in telecommunications, and I used to joke that every day it leached a little bit more of my soul. Not only just working in corporate environments where everything was like a schmuck and a brown nosing fest, but also the aspect of like what I was doing. I'm like, hey, congrats, I sold a $2 million deal to Google. And like, because Google needs more fiber, right? Like, because Google, like they literally, like, excuse the expression, I used to joke, they go to the strip club and throw around more than $2 million as a company, right? it's painful. I just realized that like I wasn't making the world better, and I wasn't aiding, helping, benefiting anybody other than big business and faceless executives. And meanwhile, I would walk through the hallways of, the offices where I'd work, and I would look at myself in the reflection of the mirrors, and I would look at the people at the desks and realize that all of us were basically slaves to unhealth, because the culture itself just sort of took all of that humanity and all of that drive and all of that desire and channeled it sort of down one path, which is make us rich so we can give you a little bit. And it had been a pretty painful 4 or 5 years in telecom before making the decision to sort of go all in with the coaching thing. We sort of got dragged into it. I've been a moderator of the community on Reddit, on Facebook for a while, and a couple of the other mods and some of the long-term members there just added us to a chat that they had created on Facebook for about 19 of us and said, hey, what's your PayPal address? We start on Monday program and we're going to get to go. And I was like, y'all are joking, right? Because I got like a day job, and Luis was running a restaurant, I believe still the bar at the time as well. And they were like, no, you're doing this. And I was about 2 weeks into it when I went, oh my God, this is the thing that I was put on this earth to do. It is putting back the parts of my soul that this job has taken away from me. And so I think almost 4 years to the day, I think it was the 31st of May or the 31st of March rather, that the company that I was working for at the time, refrain from naming them, but they're a telecom company who is both big and uses the color red. They offered a early retirement package or a buyout package, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this. And that sounded great until I sat down and was like, crap, I just cut 65% of my gainful income in half. And so, like, yes, it's a passion project. Yes, it's something I wanted to do. But man, those first years were, I guess I can survive on like one pork rind a day until we can, figure out how to rebuild the savings account. But, I will say that I believe in fortune and fortuitousness. And I really think, whatever you want to call it, I would call it God, but let's, whatever term we want to use here, the universe, whatever. When it drops money in your lap to give you a buffer and a window of time to go and pursue something that you're really passionate about and that you've got people who are thirsty and desperate for, it's such a cool thing to just be like, oh, darn, kind of situation aligned at the same time that my passion was really getting stoked and my burnout for this thing over here was really, was really kind of three roads coming together into one. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. We both have a mutual friend, Robert Sykes, over at Keto Savage, and he describes going, working all these jobs that he didn't like and, doing real estate, which he didn't like. And he was far away from home in Seattle. And I remember his story of like walking into the woods and whether it was a prayer or not, whatever he was doing was asking like, why am I here on this earth and how can I create value for somebody? And I think those questions are so valuable to ask ourselves. We can, so easily just slave away at something we don't love versus doing something we're really passionate about. And you're right, like maybe there's going to be some lean times and it's going to be challenging and we're going to have that, growth mentality, yet mentality, and learn along the way. But you're right, there is something pretty special about aligning yourself with what you're here to do and the steps that and help that you get along the way. It's like Stephen Pressfield's the War of Art, where the muse is coming in and giving you the little tips and tricks and chance meetings and things along the way. I think that's amazing.
I will say, first of all, Robert's accent and the PNW just always makes me chuckle at the notion, right? I love the guy. He's a good dude. I did a podcast with him. He's a nice guy, but, it was just like, he's sort of like me. You got that little Southern drawl thing going. And sometimes I go to places and they go, where are you from? And just kind of like, oh yeah, I'm from West Kentucky originally. So, but no, you're spot on. It's funny we get, and I think maybe it's unique to US or Western culture, but we kind of have this I'm looking for you, like a golden handcuff that sort of happens in a job or in a career. You start to get a little high on your job title, hey, I became a senior manager instead of a regular manager. Hey, what does that mean? Is it a raise, honey? No, it just means more responsibility for more people. Then you get to director, and yeah, there's a nice bump in pay. And then there's a senior director position. There's always, it's like the carrot and the stick, and there's always just these golden handcuffs that I think really keep people from pursuing their passions in earnest because of fear of like, what if I can't make enough money? What if I can't, I can't succeed? And I've had some folks ask me that before in podcasts, and my response is, what if you die having never tried?
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's such a great point. What were you guys doing at Ketogains that other people were not doing at the time? What set you apart?
I think Luis's background comes from a place of anorexia, and mine comes from a background of binge eating and addressing sort of anxiety and issues from two different sides of sort of the Venn diagram, if you will. And when he and I first started talking, it was kind of this realization, before we even really knew each other, we were just sort of Reddit acquaintances who would cross paths in chat messages or PMs. And, we saw that there was this really tight overlap that existed between behaviors that really benefited people who were, morbidly obese or obese, who really were trying to become healthier, and those people who were coming from a place of sort of self-starvation or eating disorders in that restrictive side of eating disorders, where they were really trying to introduce high quality nutrition. They were trying to introduce, food quality to the extent they could afford it. They were trying to introduce organic exercise to sort of offset some of the expenses of gyms and whatnot. And we kind of came into it from this perspective that there were a lot of things I think that the paleo and ancestral community got right. There were some things that really went off the rails. A good example of that, and you've used this analogy before, is it was a good idea to ask, should I eat this? But the minute that is this paleo supplanted or replaced, should I eat this? Are two, that it sort of jumped the shark and it became a productized or a marketed term. And I think the same thing is sort of happened within the keto and low carb space, where instead of saying, is this something that's going to benefit me nutritionally? Is this something that's going to fuel my body in a good or a healthy way? Is this something that's going to advantage me towards whatever goal I'm, pursuing? Instead, now I hear all the time, is it keto? Is it keto?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, a Snickers bar is keto if you shave it thin enough. Like, there's no issue calling anything keto. And there's some products out there that have actually manipulated their serving sizes just to pretend to sort of be low carb friendly. And I won't name too many names, but like you look at that and you're like, and then you consider how many desperate people who they're so overwhelmed, they're so scared, they're not going to pick up a book and read it. They're not going to do any of those things. They go out there and then they're met with, there are at least 6 communities I've identified in Facebook that serve for no other purpose than to market spam products to desperate people. Million+ person communities that are out there. And I see people coming to Ketogains or to Ketogenic Diets or a number of the other sort of larger Facebook groups for low carb diets. And I'll look to see before we get going, I'll click on their name, look at their groups they're in to kind of, ferret out whether they're a troll or whatever. And some of those folks are actually members of those groups. And I'll send them a note saying, hey, just so you know, I mean, like clearly you look like a legit profile. You've been online for a while. That group literally lives to sell you magic beans. Like, understand that that's not a place to go. And so a lot of it was sort of taking those sort of paleo first principles, a lot of the really good stuff that came out of that ancestral movement, if you will, and marrying them with low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets. So looking at nutrient density, looking at potential for anti-nutrients and things that might create problems, and really trying to look at a ketogenic diet and say, where has it become really difficult to get proper nutrition when you're eating a ketogenic diet? And we really looked at it from that perspective. And then the other side of the things is we've just always shot straight with people, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it hurt their feelings and it broke my heart to have to say it. We valued and respected people too much to turn them into cash registers. And it became kind of an earmark for us. We were kind of no nonsense. We didn't really sugarcoat a lot of things. It's, for a while, it was a running joke between Luis and I, where it was the Dr. Phil photo is like, I'd sugarcoat it for you, but then you try and eat that too, or whatever. But like, that was a lot of what we were really trying to do. Like I said, it really wasn't coaching. It really wasn't, let's grow this community to market to them. It was, let's grow this community to help people who want better to figure out how to get better by giving them the playbook or the advanced strategies that we've learned from a combined 35 or 40 years of eating ketogenic. Because God knows, I think we've all kind of gone down those rabbit holes or pursued after these things that sound like crazy great hacks until we gain weight or we get sick or we lose muscle mass or we stop performing well or whatever. Being able to sort of carve a path and tell people, yeah, that looks really nice until you die. So just face this way and keep going this way. Follow me, whatever, became kind of a mantra for us. And I think giving people hope by seeing someone come out of an anorexic state, and you can find the photos online, Luis looked like Michael Jackson from like the You Are Not Alone era before he really started eating and training well. And I came from it from being super obese to the point that, I weighed a quarter of a ton. And to come at it, I think it just inspired people because it wasn't another doctor who'd never been fat a day in their life. It wasn't, a group of people who had never openly talked about eating disorders or depression or anxiety or, coping mechanisms or abuse and all of those things. We tackled those things head on. And I've always said, like, opportunities present themselves when you do things for the right way or for the right reason. And we built this community just to try and help. It really wasn't about, oh, we're going to grow this in market. And then we grew from 17 people who said you start on Monday, or we start on Monday, to, think 650 or so people in boot camp these days, depending on, which camp we're talking about. So, it's definitely been a huge growth curve, but it's really been a challenge for us to figure out, like, how do we keep things, how do we keep things tracking forward? Because we're dealing with sort of second, third, fourth generation keto folks who I think have been swallowed up by a lot of the hyperbole and the rhetoric and the nonsense that's out there about how these diets work and what they do. And, in that scenario, like, we're having to I have a friend of mine who deals with working with people who come out of Christian cults, and trying to help them to at least come to a place of like an orthodox understanding of Christianity. And one of the things he says, and I think it's a brilliant statement, is in order to get them saved, you have to get them unsaved. And setting the religious or the philosophical aspects of that aside, that's a great concept or a great thought to think about. If somebody is convinced of something, we have to sort of unconvince them with evidence and detail and data and compassion and care, and then help to build them back up in a path that actually is supported by science and evidence. And so I think that's a lot of what we've done, even when it's been painful, and even when we could have cashed in or sold our souls to grow. We actually intentionally limit the group size for the sole purpose of just making sure that we have the right coaches that can work with the right folks, and making sure that we're not, I've seen some coaching services online where they're assigning, 100 or 150 clients to one coach. And I'm like, how much coaching can you actually do when you're swallowed up so much that you don't even know the names or the backstories of the people that you're working with?
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. And you can so easily lose track of your clientele if you have an unlimited amount of people that you're trying to help. It's going to be much more difficult and way less personable. So I love that story, and I love that you guys did all of this for the right reason, and that you spoke your truth. You told people what you were learning. A lot of that had to be around protein, which definitely is going to set up our conversation about gluconeogenesis. I mean, so many people in the ketogenic world were. I see people coming out of it a little bit more now, but especially when I was getting into it, 7-8 years ago, so many people were really afraid of protein and really wanted to keep the protein low, but we're having issues with muscle mass or maybe over consuming fats. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were noticing as far as your recommendations along the lines of protein and low carbohydrate?
So there was a time when Dr. Atkins used to say, eat liberally from all fish and fowl, right? Like, he wasn't constraining protein, nor was he really constraining fat. He was also known for saying, I'm not saying calories don't count. I'm saying don't count calories. And I think that he was trying to bring forward an idea to people that eating a more satiating diet really would sort of self-restrict or self-limit the amount of calories that you were actually consuming in a day. You just didn't really need to do those things in order to have at least some early successes. Somewhere along the line, and I'm not entirely sure when the switch flipped, but I have some suspicions, but they're people in the community and I respect them enough to, too much to call them out too badly. But there just started to be this narrative that you could overeat protein and it would kick you out of ketosis. And I'm sure this will be audio only, so I'm using air quotes around those expressions. So there's a little bit of snark intended here. But the problem is, while that may be true, the amount that would be necessary would be so astronomically high that it didn't make any sense. And so what we found was that people were sort of intentionally limiting protein. And there was this narrative that you got to eat fat to lose fat. And so they were, anytime that people would stall in a diet, their answer was just, I'm going to go chug more fat, or I'm going to go, it's a little cliche, but, throw a stick of butter on the side of the plate and eat that stick of butter with my eggs or whatever. And every time I think about that, I pray for my toilet. Like, that just sounds like a terrible, terrible way to live life. But there just became this narrative, and then people started really getting wrapped around the axle of like the 3-to-1 ratio and the 4-to-1 ratio stuff that exists out there. And they somehow took that data, which was intended to look at the caloric composition of a diet, the energy of the diet, and say 3-to-1 is a ratio of energy or 4-to-1 is a ratio of energy. And they transmuted that in some way. My guess is because they'd never read the research and they didn't think about it, to mass. And so they started saying that, like, if I was going to have 100 grams of protein, I would have to have 300 grams of fat, or 400 grams of fat. They really got married to these ratios. And, we would get people showing up in the community saying, I'm already eating a 70-30, or 70-25-5 diet. Why am I not losing weight? And I'm like, hey, great, that's ratios. Is that of 10,000 calories a day or 1,000 calories a day? Well, I don't know. Here's a guess of what I'm eating in the course of a day. I'm like, well, unfortunately, it's kind of that which isn't measured can't be managed. I can't really give you any insight there. But I see the switch that flipped. And that switch that flipped was people didn't think about the fact that a gram of fat has about 9 calories per gram versus protein. So you're already at 4 calories. So you're already at over 2 times the energy composition, even at a 1-to-1 by mass. And so realistically, if you go to like a 1.5-to-1 by mass, you're already at a 3-to-1 as an energy composition, a little more, almost 4-to-1. So you start to kind of it's a little bit of, there's a frustration that happens, but then there's also this empathy that sort of comes in to go, man, I have missed it on so many different things. It's hard for me to be mad at somebody or upset, but trying to correct that narrative has been a life's work at this point. I think just trying to help people, because the biggest challenge, and I think Luis nailed it when he said that eating protein and building muscle mass now is like a savings account for your retirement age or your elderly years. Because when you get to be 50, 60, 70, putting on even a pound of lean mass is basically blessing from the fate or whatever, because it's almost impossible to do outside of those early sort of newbie gains where you might get a few pounds before it shuttles off. The best thing that people can do is be eating enough protein and training and exercising now to build that up. And they just were restricting protein because the narrative was, if you're not losing, you're either eating too little fat or too much protein. And so they would shift the balance again. And it broke my heart because the data really doesn't support any of those claims. And, when we look at those things, those ratios didn't exist for fat loss diets. They existed for intractable epilepsy. Those diets were used for juvenile cases of epileptic disorders that did not respond well, or like refractory epilepsy, where they didn't respond well to medication, like pharmacologic intervention. And so they would give these diets based on these ratios. But when you look at the outcomes data for those children that went through those things, they were stunted in size. They had less muscle mass than their peers. They tended to have shorter lifespans. And that's a sad thing until you realize that you dance with the devil. You know that this can help control seizure disorders. That's going to help prolong brain activity, brain life. It's going to help to live a more robust life. You accept the consequences of this are less detrimental than the consequences of that. But to take that data and try and extrapolate that to a non-epileptic person who's simply trying to lose body mass or lose body fat, or to take that data and, another good example is like take data from type 1 diabetics and apply it to non-diabetics or to type 2 diabetics even, doesn't make any sense. It's like taking rodent studies with blind faith and applying them to people without actually testing that data. And I think that's really what happened. I think a lot of people just got, and I hate to use the term scared of protein because that sounds ridiculous, but they started to see it as the cause of their lack of fat loss rather than the single best thing they could be eating, all things equal, to help exacerbate fat loss and to retain as much muscle mass as they could during the process of losing.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. I love how you explain epilepsy in that context. And so much of this is so contextual. You really have to look at who studied, what was the desired outcome, what did they do, does that apply to me or not? And you know, the two biggest things I hear about protein when people are confused about it is, first of all, they say if you consume too much, you're going to damage the kidneys, of liver, and all that stuff. And I mean, I don't even think we need to address that. I think that's ridiculous, unless you're eating massive amounts of, you know, chicken breast or something, which is disgusting. But secondly, the thing that I hear the most is if I consume too much protein, I'm going to have too much carbohydrate, sugar in the blood. Can you talk a little bit about that and why people think that, and where they're getting off track?
So what ends up happening is, as part of the pathway, so there are enzymes that exist in the mouth. There are enzymes that exist sort of in the esophageal tract and into the stomach that start to break down the food that we eat before it really hits the stomach in earnest and goes into digestion and in the intestines themselves. Protein is ridiculously slow in digesting, but because the body, from an evolutionary perspective, kind of just presumes a meal is a meal, when protein is consumed, there is going to be a sequestration of glucose in circulation. The body's going, hey, I'm getting fed. I need to make room for getting fed. So crank up a little bit on the insulin, push all of this stuff into storage, because that's one of insulin's two main functions, is to put, it's the putter inner of things, right? I'm going to take this amino acid, I'm going to take this glucose, and I'm going to push it into the cells that can take it. And I'm going to turn up the volume as loud as I possibly have to, or as loud as I have to push those things into those cells, because I know that there is a steak coming down my gullet right now, and I'm going to get it. When you eat a diet that is not a mixed meal diet, so you're having something like, let's say, just a ribeye steak or just a strip steak or something along those lines, that sort of evolutionary wiring gets a little bit haywire, because now it's cleared this glucose, but there's not really any glucose showing back up. So insulin to glucagon ratio shift a little bit. It triggers the liver to start releasing some stored glycogen as new glucose, just to try and regulate blood sugar. And so what people do, and I think this is part of a problem, is they'll start using glucometers to try and tease out data, but they forget that there's not a control version of them sitting right beside them where they can compare. You know, I've said before, if they could clone me and we could do n=2, then I could draw some actual corollaries out. But right now I can't. They'll test their blood sugar before they eat. Then they'll test it, say, 30 minutes or 45 minutes afterwards, and they'll see that their blood glucose has risen. And they'll say, see, this is proof that protein is turning into carbohydrate. I ate too much protein because it raised my blood glucose. And the reality is, at best, and I try to use this example, let's use whey protein because it's really rapidly absorbing and it's a great example. If you just consume, you know, I've got a Monster Energy can here, but, you know, whatever, of whey protein, you know, let's say 30 grams, whatever, realistically, only about 5 to maybe 7 grams of that will even show up in digestion and into, so protein gets broken down into amino acids. When they're broken down into the amino acids across the intestinal boundary, there are things called enterocytes where the amino acids are taken up and passed over into the blood supply. That happens at a rate of about 5 to 7 grams per hour after consumption, but it takes about an hour to 2 hours before that protein even shows up in the blood supply, those amino acids. And that's been verified by radiologic tracer studies and everything else. It is almost illogical to think that something that hasn't even made its way into my blood supply yet is actually being converted into something else and dropped into my blood supply. The logic doesn't make sense. But let's set that aside for a minute and deal with, let's say it's already there and the 5 to 7 grams of amino acid is transferring into the blood supply. The data suggests that even a ketogenic person where gluconeogenesis is actually going to be a little bit higher as a percentage of energy than a non-ketogenic individual, you're looking at about 13 to 15% of protein theoretically being converted to, well, I should say about 37% of proteins or the amino acids could be converted, but realistically only about somewhere between 11 and 15% actually would. And that's at a maximal level. The data I've seen suggests it's more like about 5%. So of that 5 grams, let's say, because it makes the math really, really easy, right? You've got 5 grams and you're talking about 5%, you're talking about 0.25 grams of amino acid being available for the process of gluconeogenesis, or being used for the process of gluconeogenesis. And so people are drawing these corollaries, and to be honest, then we say nothing about the fact that it then goes to first pass metabolism into the liver, where as the liver's already released some of its stored glycogen into circulation, the liver is just going to swallow up most of whatever glucose is there to sort of replenish its glycogen stores. And there's this notion in the ketogenic space that the liver is exhausted of glycogen when you become ketogenic. And if that happens, it's not called ketosis, it's called death. That's not a thing. It is definitely diminished to some greater or lesser extent. And I don't know that anybody's really ever done like a perfus study to really figure out what that is, but it is diminished. It's not gone. And so people are sort of, there's this expression in the keto space, like, don't blame the butter for what the bread did or whatever. But like, I think that they're blaming the protein for what your evolutionary adaptations actually are. They're drawing conclusions about blood glucose increases being because protein, and it's really just because you ate. And it's a really intriguing thing, because you see that even if I were to say, okay, hey, 5 grams shows up, we see, do all the math conversions, whatever. Let's assume for the minute that 1 gram is theoretically available. Well, gluconeogenesis costs about 33% of the substrate anyway, so you're already back down to 0.75 or 0.66, grams before it even really matters, and the body's already kind of cleared the runway. The insulin is therefore serving a purpose. The insulin raised from protein is actually to help make sure that blood glucose raised doesn't remain in circulation for long periods of time. It's also there to help drive more amino acid into skeletal muscle tissue, into smooth muscle tissue, to push it into the tissues and structures of the body responsible for sex hormone production, immune hormone, or thyroid function. All of these things are what are called peptide hormones. So sometimes we only talk about protein as like, how does it affect my biceps, right? But we need to appreciate that your skin, your nails, your hair, your sex hormones, your thyroid hormones, and the signaling hormones for thyroid. So almost everything endocrine, everything exocrine relies on some component of amino acid as well. And so there is just this weird narrative. And then the thing that people don't appreciate when they say don't eat too much protein or it can kick you out of ketosis is that the glycerol backbone of the triglycerides that you're eating, so the fat molecules in the food that you're eating, glycerol has a faster and less metabolically expensive pathway to insert itself into gluconeogenesis than any amino acid. So, glycerol will gladly convert to glucose, and it's more cost efficient metabolically to do so. There's another one too. If we're going to talk about that, we don't eat too much fat or you'll kick yourself out of ketosis would be a thing that you might have to say. But what about the Cori cycle and the lactate from exercise? Are we going to say don't exercise too much, you're going to kick yourself out of ketosis? Like, at some point, we maybe should stop worrying about exactly what our ketone levels are and start worrying about how am I performing, how am I recovering, how am I feeling, how am I looking, how are things happening, how am I feeling emotionally? Because I do think that sometimes getting this neurotic about details and data helps to sort of drive people into panicked behavior, where if they don't have the outcome they're looking for, it must mean I'm eating too much of this or not enough of that. And they start making these huge changes. And then sometimes just by sheer coincidence in time, they see a weight change. And then they conclude that, oh, it must be because I only ate yak fat, along with, lean protein mixed into a ball that I cooked in the oven. And people think I'm crazy when I say this, but there are studies that exist out there that put people in front of computers and said, every time that this blinks, you get like $1. And if you can figure out the pattern, then, obviously you can make the thing blink more often on the screen and you'll just get more money. By the time that they finished the study, having not told the people in the study that it was completely random and there was no way for them to do it, they had answers like that if I stand on this chair and touch this fan and this particular blade, like the computer screen will. They had drawn pictures out of the white noise and concluded insane, complex, ridiculous ways to get that extra dollar out of this scientific study. And I just worry sometimes that people have forgotten that nobody that I'm aware of in the history of humanity has ever gotten fat by eating protein. Maybe that's a little hyperbolic, but the data is pretty clear. You almost can't eat enough protein to cause the body to gain weight because you've got the thermic effect. I mean, there's so many other benefits that exist there on a per calorie basis that I'd be more inclined to say eat more protein than I would to say eat less protein in a ketogenic diet. And I think Bill Lagakos and some other folks have pulled out studies showing that there is actually an increased need for protein in a ketogenic diet, not a decreased need. So that's a long-winded answer, like most of my answers have been today, but that is the fastest version of a primer on gluconeogenesis that I can give.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I love that it was such a thoughtful answer. The study you mentioned sounded like me as a kiddo trying to get a Nintendo cartridge to work in an NES. Like blow on it, you got to put it through your shirt. If you're turning like counterclockwise like 3 or 4 times while you're like fighting off your buddies who want to play Ninja Turtles with you or something, like that's how the cartridge works.
You had to push the button, turn it off, push it back real fast. Like there were so many different unwritten rules for every Nintendo. Yeah, and the reality is if you're just taking some alcohol and put it on a cotton swab or something and wiped it gently, it would have worked like a champ. So
yeah, totally.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's exactly right. We are wired to find signals in the noise. You know, it is to our evolutionary benefit to see the tiger that's inside of that bush. And sometimes I think we just identify patterns that aren't there and we conclude false narratives and we let them drive the entirety of some aspect of our existence. And I think sometimes the keto thing really does a lot of that. It kind of creates this sort of tiger in the bush mentality of diet and lifestyle change where, you know, I know Amy's been banging this drum for years, but it ain't that difficult. You know, eat enough protein, don't overeat fat if you're trying to lose body fat. You know, get enough carbs that you feel good, but not so much that it creates blood glucose roller coasters. And if a glucometer helps you to figure that out, then that's awesome. But if it causes you to act neurotic, throw it in the trash or donate it to a local hospital or something. Get rid of it because it's creating tiger in the bush syndrome for you. And it's not healthy. It's not going to benefit you in any way.
Yeah, I love that. So I guess, I hope I phrase this question correctly. How much value do you put into tracking certain metrics? Could be blood sugar, could be ketones, could be cholesterol markers, could be all these different things versus, let's say, somebody like, you know, a Sean Baker who says, similar to what you said before, like, how do you feel? Like in my opinion, the best way to determine your best tomorrow is to be really good today. Like if you feel good, if you can do all the things you want to do, if you have good energy and mental clarity, I want it to be true that I don't need to pay as much attention to some of those other markers, and that will set me up for the best future. What do you think about that?
I think that if you're 99% of the way to wherever you're trying to go and you're trying to tease out the absolute best results, then unquestionably more, you know, it's like any negotiation, the person with more data typically wins, right? You know, in those sort of only one side can win tense negotiations, the person with the most information and the most accurate information has the best chance of winning. Or to put it in a more simple term, the best hand in a poker game usually wins the pot. And, you know, unless you suck at poker. But, you know, I think that the reality here is sometimes I think it's beneficial, and I think it's beneficial for a subset of people who are scientifically minded or who really just want to get the best result from the start, and they don't want to muck around with figuring it out or being intuitive until they get to a point where they're like, hey, I'm much more comfortable in how I feel, how I look, how I move, how I think, how I function. Now I'm going to take it a little bit looser. I'm not going to track. I'm not going to measure all this stuff quite as aggressively. I'll check it maybe once or twice a week, make sure things are going. Maybe every 3 months, I'll come back to it and get some lab testing done. I think that's a very reasonable place to be. But I have seen within the biohacking community, and I always get them, stirred up like hornets' nest when I say this. If the keto community is a little neurotic, the biohacking community is bat crap crazy. With respect to markers and data and algorithms and calculations and ketone to glucose indicators and all, like they're trying to tease this out. And I'm probably going to catch a lot of shade for saying this, but a good friend of mine, a pretty well-known person in the industry, said to me one time that he thought that biohacking was comprised entirely of middle-aged white men who were scared of death. And I was like, I think that's probably a fairly accurate assessment. Maybe not with the white part, but like, just in terms of just looking when I've gone to these conferences and spoken at these events and seen the people there and the things that they're going through. And I'm like, look, dude, cool. Red light therapy helps you because you live north of an equator or north of a particular line of longitude or latitude. And like, you need that. That's cool. But you know what else works? Go the hell outside and lay in the sun for a while. Go do some exercise outside. Go for a walk. You'd be surprised because not only are you hitting all of the good vitamin D conversion stuff, you're also improving serotonin and norepinephrine. Like so many things benefit from just going outside and using nature's own version of a red light therapy machine. And, the other thing that I think it does is it paints this picture for folks that financially can't afford that stuff, that like somehow their life is diminished or that they can't have the results that someone else had because they don't have access to the neuralizer that you put on your forehead that changes your brain waves by shocking you and the red light that goes into your veins. And I mean, it gets to a point where it becomes absurd, truly absurd. And that's the point when it becomes neurotic, when it becomes ridiculous, and you start making decisions based on incomplete data, like the quantitative data rather than the qualitative data. It starts to become a real problem. And if you're not willing to say, hey, great, I'm a quant guy, and I grew up in business. I mean, if I can't measure it, I can't make decisions on it, right? I'm a quantitative guy at my core. But if I ignore the qualitative aspects of any client I have or myself or anyone else that comes in my path, I can give them all the best information in the world, give them all the correct information. But if I walk away having not met them at like a human level and kind of met them where they are and spent time and invested with them, they're never going to improve because I've ignored the qualitative or the quantitative. And I think the same is true with a lot of the measuring stuff. And I agree with Sean on this. And there's a number of folks in the community who are screaming this, and we're notorious for track what you eat and measure what you eat, but within the context of a boot camp or within the context of a goal that you haven't achieved yet. When you've achieved that goal or when you've reached kind of your good enough point, I hope you get to a point where you can eat in a more intuitive way and that you can stop needing to know what your GKI is before you can decide whether it's an appropriate time to eat. I use my glucose measures to determine when I should break my fast. Like, I got an idea. Use your stomach. Are you hungry? Friggin' eat something. Like, or if you're trying to cut fat, acknowledge that hunger is just part of the process and you're going to have to make peace with that. But trying to turn a qualitative feeling like hunger into a quantitative measure is, the words I have for it will get this an NC-17 rating. So I'll just bite my tongue and say I'm not a big fan of over analyzing data, because I think it creates paralysis in our decision making. And I think when it doesn't create paralysis, it creates that sort of tiger in the bush mentality where we're making decisions and concluding things that the evidence quantitatively the evidence does not bear out the qualitative feeling that you have that there's a tiger in that bush because you've made a false correlation.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's so interesting. I love that point. I think it just, to me, it really seems like we're we're like overthinking things that the body just kind of knows how to do. And if we just get out of our own way, and like you said, eat when you're hungry, go outside because that's what you should do. Go move when you feel like it. If you just stuck with those things, we'd probably all be just fine. And we just have so much of this idea of like technology and all these things that we need to be able to determine how we feel to begin with. It just seems completely unnecessary.
I'll say Dr. Andy Galpin wrote a book about that very topic, and I think it's really apropos. And I apologize, the name of the book's escaping me right now, but it was talking about how many gadgets we're using to try and make decisions that actually prevent us from doing the damn things that we intended to do in the first place or that we should have done. And so I sort of step back and I look at this and I just say to myself, like, look, when you eat foods that are foods, when you're eating a high satiety, higher volume diet that is lower in caloric intake, generally speaking, it's funny, like I'll work with clients who are, really desperately trying to lose fat, and I may put them on like, say, 1100, 1200 calorie diet, and they throw a fit and they lose their mind. And I'm like, just give me 2 weeks and then we'll pick this back up. And then about a week later, I'll get this message and I'll be like, oh my God, I cannot eat all of this food. And the reason is because 1200 calories of Twinkies is a whole lot different than 1200 calories of, grilled chicken, grilled chicken thigh with some asparagus and a little bit of, so for the paleo-ish folks, maybe some brown rice or something off to the side. It's crazy how much more food you can consume in terms of volume and mass for the same calorie intake as what we're getting in a Western diet. And so, when we kick that over and we start eating in a more, I do cringe a little bit when I say ancestral way, because I think there were a lot of ancestral diets that existed in different areas. But when we start eating in a more, I guess, evolutionarily appropriate way, we just don't tend to overeat. We don't tend towards, I've never seen somebody having a panic attack go, I'm going to lose it right now. Somebody didn't get me some grilled asparagus. Like, that's just not a thing. You stop seeking out those foods to deal with the issues, because in having a full stomach, because you're eating good, wholesome foods, you don't really have the room to throw the Twinkies down or the cupcakes or whatever. And you start to have to kind of deal with the anxiety as its own thing, rather than coalescing or commingling it with my hunger levels, or, how many sodas that I have today, or whatever the thing is that is your coping mechanism for that anxiety or for that phobia or whatever it is you're dealing with.
Yeah, totally. Divorcing those two things can be really challenging initially. But you're right. I think it's worth the challenge to be able to go through that, to see that they are two separate things. You don't need the one to deal with the other. The other is still going to be there. And unless you're being very conscious and really facing those anxieties or fears or whatever it is you're facing without trying to cover it up, I mean, that's the only way those things can kind of lessen and go away, is by bringing that consciousness into it rather than hiding behind something else, food, alcohol, drugs, whatever it is.
And that is the biggest difficulty in change across the board, is sometimes I think we fall into that analysis paralysis thing, because the notion of being able to change scares us. And so getting wrapped around the axle of, once I figure out the appropriate diet for me, then I'll make the efforts to change. Or once I go to a gym, or once like they'll start putting these sort of can kicking conditions onto it, because it feels like making progress without actually making any progress. It's sort of like they talk about in like motivational interviewing, that you're creating the intention to do a thing without actually taking any steps towards doing it. It still releases dopamine. It still actually triggers the body to go, I did good. Give me a Snickers bar. By the way, y'all will figure out my favorite candy based on how many times I've referenced a Snickers bar in this episode. But, I think that it's just a really interesting thing that people sometimes think that losing weight is about the food. And I think that to some degree it is, in the sense that if we're eating good quality foods, we tend to sort of naturally make other changes. But man, if that's the case, then why does every single diet on the planet, keto included, have like an 80 to 95% recidivism rate after 2 to 3 years? And it's because we're not addressing the underlying issues in our lifestyles and in our relationships and the other things that affect, drive, and impact how and when and how much and how often we eat. And so we just get driven right back to it. We get driven right back to the pizza parlor because, my husband really wants to go there and it's his favorite place and it's where we fell in love. Well, then he gets upset because I only have a diet soda while he's sitting there eating pizza. There's just so many stories I've heard over the years from people justifying and explaining why. And in every case, it's boundary crossing relationships. It's unaddressed anxiety that they won't talk to a therapist or get help for. It's abuse histories and eating to cope with those things and the really nasty side effects of that. There's 1,000 different stories, but they all come back to, I changed my diet temporarily, but I didn't use the margin that I created by changing my diet to affect, impact, and improve the lifestyle that I'm living to try and make change.
That's such a good point. I absolutely love that. Well, you've referenced Snickers bars, and so hopefully we get a show sponsorship. Maybe we can monetize.
Well, see what you can do. The Mound or the Mars company better step up here or do something.
Great. Exactly. We plugged them a lot. But you've also referenced The Simpsons. You've said one of my favorite phrases, which is jumping the shark, that not a lot of people know that I absolutely love. And so you, my friend, have a lifetime invite of returning to our show anytime to go more in depth into some of your other endeavors, including Element, all the things you've done there. I'd be really curious to talk to you about all those things. There's just not enough hours in the day to chat with you. Absolutely love the content from today. I've really learned a lot and seen things in a different light. And I think you approach things in a very reasonable and thoughtful way, which I really appreciate. If you had, one thing that somebody listening to this podcast could take away from this conversation and apply to their lives, what would that be? I think I might know the direction you're going to go in this, but I'm still curious to hear.
It's always a fun question. This is one of those where I'm stalling for time because I've got about 15 things racing through my head, but it has nothing to do with a fork. I would say this: forgive more people in your life and start with yourself. So many people carry grudges against themselves and they don't realize how it's affecting their perspective of the world, their perspective of their neighbors and their friends and their spouses. They don't understand how it's affecting how often and what they're shoving down their gullet and how they feel and how it's affecting their sleep and their immune function and their mood and their, all of this stuff. Just let S word go. Let it pass. Somebody wronged you, okay. Somebody cheated you, okay. And that doesn't mean you have to be passive, but if it's still living in your brain, if it is still eating at you, and if it's you eating at you, you're going to eat. That's just, most people gravitate to food, alcohol, sex, drugs, or gambling. Those are the big ones. And so often I talk with people and, I've had meetings at conferences and I've watched people break down because they just had this realization that there was anger towards themselves, that self-judgment, that whatever. Let it go. Just let it go. Live your life. Go do the things you enjoy. To hell with anybody that has a different opinion or thinks differently. That's their problem, not yours, and just do your thing.
Wow. Follow-up question to that. How difficult was that advice for you to take in your own life and your own personal journey?
Extremely. And I think it will be for everyone because we know what we know. Habits and patterns are habits and patterns for a reason, and breaking them sometimes feels weird. To this day, after having lost 300 pounds, I still am uncomfortable taking my shirt off in public. It still creates anxiety in me. I go down a laundry list of these things. I still, when I go to a restaurant where I used to eat all the time, I still avoid the table that we used to eat at. I will literally wait for another table rather than going and sitting there. There is just a psychology to all of it that is twice as hard as you think, and it'll take twice as long as you think. But at the end of the day, it will be twice as sweet as you actually believe it'll be. And so,
yeah. Well, this is why I love the title of your book, Kintsukuroi. Can you just briefly say why you landed on that and what that is in Japanese culture?
So I actually had someone ask me this question. I was doing a speaking gig in Virginia, and I was trying to explain it as, I don't think they quite got the reference. So I lost 300 pounds. I actually had about an 8-hour surgery to reconstruct arms and stomach and stuff after that was, said and done. Kintsukuroi is the Japanese art of taking broken vessels and actually putting them back together using gold filament or lead or silver filament, and usually it's gold or silver. And I just was looking one day, I had my shirt off, I'd gotten out of the shower, and I was looking at the suture lines under my arms and on my sides and my chest, and I thought, I literally am a broken vessel that's been put back together. And it just became something really impressive as I got to reading more about it and understanding that the broken vessel that's been put back together is actually more highly prized in Japanese culture than a whole vessel that hasn't been broken and restored, because the broken vessel has been used, it's been touched by ancestors, it's been treated roughly and restored by loving hands. And so there's just a lot of symbolism and meaning behind the term that doesn't just sort of start and end with Tyler likes Japanese culture, which I do. It's more to do with the fact that I am a broken vessel.
I absolutely love that. Tyler Cartwright, this has been an amazing conversation. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
So normally when I'm on a video, I'll say I'll be the only Tyler Cartwright that looks like me when you go to find me on social media. But two things happen. One, I figured out that that's not true because I have had my pictures a few times. And secondly, we're on audio, so that won't be a thing. But so Ketogains and Facebook and Reddit and Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, you'll find me there. I'm happy to jump in there. I am on Instagram at Ty_Cartwright because I was a late adopter and had to take a stupid version of my name. Facebook, you can find me there. I'll be bearded with a giant head and I'm pretty hard to miss. So there's that. I will tell a fun story. My Twitter account is at Tyler Cartwright and I'm very seldom there. But I had been at Tyler Cartwright too for a long time, and I kept sending messages to this account at Tyler Cartwright that never posted anything, never did anything, and I was pissed, like, I mean, angry about like how this person wouldn't respond. I was like, dude, swap me handles. Like, you don't use it. I operate kind of in the public eye, and I'd really like to have it. I'll pay you. Just we'll work something out. No response. And then one day my account got messed with a little bit. And so I went to reset the password and I said, for which account do you want to reset the password? And it dawned on me that sometime early in the days of Twitter, whether I'd had a drink or two, I don't know what happened, but I apparently created at Tyler Cartwright and then never used it. And then I had been messaging myself, trying to get me to give me the username that I was trying to get. So for those of you that thought he's smart, no, I'm not. I am a big old goofy redneck from West Kentucky, and that's what I am. So I now have at Tyler Cartwright, and I threw at Tyler Cartwright 2 in the trash. But so you'll find me there. I am generally most active in Reddit and Facebook. I live in Tennessee, so come find me.
That's awesome. We will link to all of that in the show notes. I was wondering if you were offended by you calling you certain names and trying to get that Twitter account. Weren't offended at all. Tough skin.
I didn't call myself too many names, but I was pretty upset with the, like, shadow me, if you will. I was pretty annoyed at first, and then I was like, well, this is a great story to give at the beginning of any lecture where I want people to understand that I am not nearly as smart as they come away thinking. So for sure.
That's amazing. I absolutely love that. Tyler Cartwright, thank you again so much for your journey and for everything you've learned along the way. And thank you so much for doing the right thing the right way and helping educate people and helping inspire people along the way, and keeping that human element and not just be, a bunch of data or metrics or macros that people need to hit. I think it's really important that you're making so many great connections with people. And we're so appreciative of you and your work and for taking some time out with us today. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
Absolutely. It was an honor. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.